most important figure in the genre for a variety of reasons. Where the crime disrupts, the detective restores order. Where the crime damages the social fabric, the detective repairs the rip in that fabric. If crime represents an illness within the body politic, then the detective is the doctor that treats that body and restores it to health. Most importantly, where the crime represents the eruption of the irrational and the uncertain into everyday life, the detective personifies rationality and certainty. He represents the belief that crime is only ever a temporary disruption of the norm and that the norm can be re-established. In order to accomplish this wide variety of tasks, the detective must also be a various figure. Indeed, the reason for the enduring success of this figure is its ability to change and adapt with the times, reflecting our society's differing needs and fears over a long period of time. Later, we'll discuss two major variations of the detective type, the private eye and the law enforcement professional. For now, though, we'll study the classic version of the detective as he or she appears in the work of three giants of the genre: Edgar Allan Poe, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Agatha Christie. By looking at the personalities, motives, and methods of the detectives created by these writers, we'll be able to see how and why this figure is so crucial to mystery and suspense fiction. Any investigation of the detective must begin with Poe's character of C. Auguste Dupin, who first appears in 1841 in Poe's first mystery story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue. In this story, a mother and daughter have been brutally murdered in a locked room. Dupin investigates this puzzling mystery and eventually deduces that the murders were committed by an escaped orangutan. One of the most striking aspects of this story is that we don't meet Dupin until the second section of the story, after a very dry and abstract opening section whose relevance to either the mystery or the detective is obscure. In fact, whenever I teach this story, I warn my students that they will probably find it heavy going, and that by the time they reach the end, they may find themselves feeling very bloodthirsty and wondering desperately when the murder is going to occur. So what's the purpose of the opening section of The Murders in the Rue Morgue? And why does Poe delay Dupin's appearance? Poe devotes the opening section of the story to describing the activity of analysis and the analyst, the person who personifies this activity. We learn that analysis involves the application of a method of disentangling, that analysis is creative, that it's pleasurable to the analyst, and that it requires flexibility and variety. All of these points will help us understand Dupin, the prototypical detective, and Poe suggests as much at the end of this opening section, when he has his narrator remark somewhat enigmatically that the narrative we are about to read should be taken as a commentary on the propositions just advanced. What does the narrator mean? As the second section of Rue Morgue begins and we're introduced to Dupin, we realize that he's the analyst described in the opening section of the tale, that the detective and the analyst are one and the same, and that Poe delays Dupin's entry into the story so that we understand exactly who he is and what he's meant to signify once he walks on stage. For example, the narrator is at pains to emphasize that the analyst's conclusion will often appear, to the casual observer, to be the product of intuition or even of guesswork. When we see Dupin detecting, however, we're meant to realize that nothing could be further from the truth. Dupin himself frequently points out, as he investigates the case, that he's following a rigorous method wherever it may take him. Indeed, one way to read Poe's notorious choice of an orangutan as his killer in his first mystery story is that this bizarre result exemplifies how Dupin remains true to his analytical method, no matter how unexpected or strange the results of that method might be. But as we follow the story to its surprising conclusion, we also realize that, like the analyst, Dupin, the prototypical detective, finds the activity of analysis pleasurable. When he decides to look into the Rue Morgue murders more deeply, Dupin comments to his friend, our narrator, that doing so will afford them some amusement. Even the narrator, who is inclined towards slavish and uncritical devotion to Dupin, thinks this is a strange thing to say, but it does speak to a very important issue: the detective's motive, or why the detective even bothers to investigate crime in the first place. Although Poe suggests that Dupin wants to solve the Rue Morgue murders partly to exonerate the man who has been falsely accused of the crimes, it becomes clear to us that Dupin's own pleasure, along with the thrill of the intellectual challenge and the opportunity to embarrass the police, are what really motivates Dupin. In other words, the detective doesn't always have honorable or admirable motives for detecting. We see further evidence of this point in The Mystery of Marie Roget, Poe's second tale featuring Dupin. In this story, Dupin investigates the mysterious murder of Marie Roget, a well-known and fashionable young woman from Paris whose body is found floating in the River Seine. Dupin states that the first order of business is to make sure that the body pulled from the Seine is indeed that of Marie Roget. Why? Because only solving the murder of Roget will allow Dupin to collect the large reward on offer. Even in the third and final Dupin tale, The Purloined Letter, Dupin's desire to help the royal personage who is being blackmailed is clearly outweighed by his need to take his revenge on the blackmailer, the Minister D, who, we learn, did Dupin an evil deed in the past. This is why Dupin is so careful to let the minister know who has defeated him. Dupin's motives for doing detective work illustrate the perhaps surprising fact that in many ways the detective is not meant to be a particularly admirable or heroic figure. Years of teaching Poe have taught me that students find it very hard to connect with Dupin as a character. Even though he's undoubtedly brilliant, insightful, and learned, he's also arrogant, selfish, and greedy. This isn't a slip-up on Poe's part. Instead, it indicates the fact that one of Poe's most important contributions in developing the detective is to make that figure something of an outsider, marginal in relation to society at large. At first glance, this might seem like an eccentric claim to make about Dupin. After all, we're told that Dupin is a member of one of the oldest and most illustrious families in France. Moreover, he's a chevalier, one of the highest honors that France can bestow on one of its citizens. So what could be marginal about him? Well, for one thing, his family has fallen on hard times. Dupin may be from an aristocratic family, but he's basically penniless and is supported by his friend, the narrator. The two of them live a quiet, almost reclusive existence in a moth-eaten mansion in a remote and unfashionable district of Paris, miles away from the fashionable and influential Parisian elite. Why does Poe make Dupin so marginal? Poe perceives that the detective might be a necessary response to crime, but that does not mean that this figure will always be celebrated. As important as the detective is to mystery and suspense fiction, the figure is frequently accompanied by a certain ambiguity, almost as if his association with crime contaminates him. What fascinates us most about the detective, in other words, is the figure's hidden depths and complexities. How did other writers both take up and transform this figure as the genre developed? The obvious place to look for an answer to this question is the character who is clearly inspired by Dupin, but whose differences illustrate the variety and complexity of the detective figure, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. Holmes first appeared in print in 1887 in the novel A Study in Scarlet. Beginning in 1891 with the story A Scandal in Bohemia, Holmes's popularity skyrocketed thanks to his regular appearances in the Strand magazine. After Conan Doyle apparently killed off his famous creation in The Final Problem in 1893, no new Holmes stories appeared until 1901, when Conan Doyle began serializing the novel The Hound of the Baskervilles. Starting in 1903 with The Adventure of the Empty House, Holmes once again became a familiar figure, with Doyle's final story, The Adventure of Shoscombe Old Place, appearing in 1927. In many ways, Holmes seems to be a carbon copy of Dupin. Like his predecessor, he is extremely eccentric. He gets so bored between cases that he takes cocaine to help the time pass more easily, and he famously shoots his pistol at the wall of his apartment in the shape of the letters VR to express his patriotic support of Queen Victoria. He is an amateur detective who shares Dupin's contempt for the police, his professional counterparts in crime solving. He also takes great pleasure, intellectual and otherwise, in his work as a detective. Just as Dupin enjoys the challenge of a difficult case, so Holmes is drawn to those cases that are unusual and baffling, especially if they give him a chance to dress up in one of his many disguises and go off on an adventure. And like Dupin, Holmes is frequently more interested in poetic rather than official justice. He seems relatively unperturbed when Irene Adler, his antagonist in the first Holmes short story, A Scandal in Bohemia, avoids arrest and then leaves the country. And in The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, Holmes famously lets the guilty party, James Ryder, go, arguing that he has learned his lesson and will never commit a crime again. Despite these similarities between Dupin and Holmes, the way Doyle introduces innovations to the figure of the detective helps to explain both the popularity of Holmes and the influence and importance of the detective figure to mystery and suspense fiction. In short, Doyle makes Holmes much more human than Dupin. For example, even though Dupin insists that he has a method and frequently demonstrates that method, at no point are we meant to feel that we can imitate that method. We are not meant to emulate Poe's version of the detective. The situation is very different in Doyle's work. Just like Dupin, Holmes constantly talks about and demonstrates his method, but unlike Dupin, he demystifies that method, making it seem more like a matter of keen observation and common sense than abstruse knowledge and technical expertise. For example, in what quickly became a ritual element of the Holmes stories, Holmes deduces certain facts about the people who come to see him by examining their appearance. However, Holmes always then goes on to explain how he arrived at those deductions, and in doing so, he frequently minimizes his own ingenuity. After one such explanation, Jabez Wilson, Holmes's client in the Red-Headed League, comments to Holmes that there's nothing at all to Holmes's methods once he's explained them to him. In response, Holmes acknowledges to Watson that such candor risks ruining his reputation. But he maintains this candor, which is just one of the reasons that the average reader finds it much easier to relate to Doyle's version of the detective. A second major reason that readers find Holmes more human is his relationship with his closest friend, John Watson. Even though Dupin and the narrator are companions, it's a stretch to call them friends in the conventional sense of the word. Dupin seems to use his companion, who Poe never even names, as an audience for his monologues rather than regarding him as an equal. The relationship between Holmes and Watson is completely different. Even though Holmes has his own reclusive tendencies, there's no doubt that he and Watson care for each other deeply. Watson frequently accompanies Holmes on his adventures, playing a much more active role in the stories than Dupin's companion ever does. Holmes' relationship with Watson endears him and the figure of the detective to the reader. It's worth noting that Holmes's humanity also defines some of his professional connections. For example, although many of Holmes's clients are the rich and powerful, including the crowned heads of Europe, he's also drawn to clients from far more humble backgrounds. This suggests that his motives for doing detective work are very different from those of Dupin. Holmes decides to take on the case of the Red-Headed League, for example, not because it promises to pay well, but because he's never come across anything like it, and it piques his curiosity. Moreover, the red-headed Mr. Wilson tells Holmes he came to him for help because Holmes has a reputation for helping poor people in need, which speaks to the fact that Holmes is infinitely more generous and philanthropic than Dupin. In a similar vein, even though Miss Helen Stoner, Holmes's client in The Adventure of the Speckled Band, tells him that she cannot at present pay him for his services, Holmes still agrees to take the case, not only because it intrigues him, but also because he realizes Stoner has been mistreated by her brutal stepfather, and he wants to save her from further harm. It's impossible to imagine the somewhat cold-blooded Dupin exhibiting such chivalry. These various manifestations of Holmes's humanity also speak to his reasons for being a detective, which to some extent duplicate Dupin's, while also diverging from Dupin's in significant ways. For Dupin, solving crimes is never anything more than a hobby. Years pass between each of his 3 cases, and even though we're told he becomes famous for his exploits, Dupin is not motivated at all by the desire for fame. He continues to maintain his reclusive isolation as rigidly as ever. For Holmes, however, detecting is not merely a hobby, it's a vocation. We know this partly because Holmes scrupulously updates files containing information on an enormous variety of subjects, files that he consults frequently throughout the stories. The sheer volume of cases that Holmes undertakes is one indication that detecting is far more central to his sense of self than it ever was to Dupin. But Holmes's sense of detective work as a vocation also comes across when we try to understand why it feels inaccurate to say that being a detective is Holmes's job. Even though Holmes describes himself as a professional consulting detective, it is inaccurate to say that Holmes is a detective by profession, because this doesn't really capture the essence of why Holmes detects. This essence comes across most clearly when Holmes is preparing for his confrontation with Professor Moriarty in The Final Problem. Holmes admits it's very possible that this confrontation might lead to his demise, but he tells Watson that he can consider that prospect with equanimity. Why? Because in defeating Moriarty, he will eliminate the most dangerous criminal alive, and in doing so, he will help to protect and maintain the safety of society. In other words, Holmes regards himself as a public servant. Like Dupin, Holmes occupies the fringes of the society in which he lives, in the sense that he's a loner who doesn't seek out public recognition or connection. But he's still an integral part of that society, and he works hard to protect it. In this sense, Doyle both redeems and expands the figure of the detective. Because Holmes is willing to put his considerable gifts to work to serve his society, the detective comes much closer to being a heroic figure than ever before. All that said, I don't want to give the impression that Holmes is the ancestor of Superman, standing on the rooftops of London with his tweed cape fluttering in the breeze. Despite his many positive qualities, the imperfections of Holmes in particular, and the detective in general, still play an important role in endearing him to readers of mystery and suspense fiction. For example, although Holmes's impatience with the police hardly compares to the delight Dupin takes in tormenting the poor prefect of the Parisian police, Holmes's low opinion of the police demonstrates that the detective is still somewhat arrogant and automatically assumes that he has a level of insight and intelligence no one else possesses. Similarly, while it would be inaccurate to say that Holmes is motivated by the desire for money and fame, he's usually careful to make sure that he gets paid in one way or another, and he's definitely aware of his public profile. Holmes often complains that Dr. Watson's accounts of their adventures are overly fictionalized and exaggerated, but such complaints are a little disingenuous. Although he is reclusive, there's a side of Holmes that also enjoys the spotlight and loves to feel needed. He understands that Watson's stories have done much to develop and maintain his reputation. Conceit, it seems, is part and parcel of being a detective and part of the reason we love this figure. With that conceit in mind, we can now move on to discuss the character of Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, who is one of Christie's most famous and enduring characters. Even though Christie once described him as a detestable, bombastic, tiresome, egocentric little creep, she refused to kill him off because he was so popular with her readers. Poirot first appears in Christie's debut novel, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, in 1920, and he makes his final appearance in her penultimate novel, Curtain, in 1975. In between those two dates, Poirot appeared in one play, more than 50 short stories, and 33 novels, including Murder on the Orient Express, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and Death on the Nile. Perhaps more than any other writer in the genre, Christie understood the importance of giving the reader of mystery and suspense fiction a carefully calibrated combination of predictable, familiar genre elements, along with innovations and twists, so the reader could be simultaneously reassured by what they knew and challenged by what they didn't. We see precisely this combination of the familiar and the unfamiliar at work in the character of Poirot. On the one hand, he has a level of arrogance about his abilities as a detective that is thoroughly familiar to any reader of the genre. It's also something we'd never dream of objecting to because we don't require our detectives to be modest. On the other hand, in Poirot, that intellectual arrogance is combined with a conceit about his appearance, particularly his clothes, his hair, and above all, his mustache, that makes him faintly ridiculous, or at the very least, comedic. This comedic touch, which is also suggested by the contrast between the heroic associations of Hercule's name and his distinctly diminutive and unheroic physical presence, is a major innovation on Christie's part because it reconfigures what constitutes the authority of the detective. In some respects, Poirot represents a return to the earlier model of the detective embodied by Dupin rather than Holmes. It's no mistake that so many Holmes stories have the word adventure in the title. One of the secrets of Doyle's success is that he combined elements of the analytical puzzle mystery with elements taken from the adventure story. Holmes and Watson are frequently armed and exposed to physical danger in the stories. And when you add in Doyle's occasional flashes of romance and comedy, you have a thoroughly hybridized and highly entertaining form of mystery story. By contrast, I think it's fair to say that neither Dupin nor Poirot would ever willingly expose themselves to danger simply because neither of them could fight their way out of a wet paper bag. They rely on brains rather than brawn, whether in the form of Dupin's analytical skills or Poirot's famous little grey cells. When you combine Poirot's lack of physicality with his tendency towards pomposity and conceit, you might expect his authority as a detective to be undermined as a result. And yet it isn't. Why not? Partly because of another innovation that Christie introduces in the character of Poirot, namely his age. By making Poirot significantly older than previous detectives, Christie is able to convey the impression of infinite experience, an experience that demands respect from the reader while also encouraging humor with regard to Poirot's repeated and obviously half-hearted attempts to retire. Christie then combines Poirot's age very cannily with his status as a foreigner to increase his authority still further. On the one hand, Poirot's status as a Belgian detective working in England is a continuation of a tendency we've already seen to make the detective an outsider, especially in the context of a notoriously xenophobic country as England in the 1920s. But on the other hand, Poirot's foreignness gives him a distance from English culture that makes him seem more objective, more capable of seeing what others may overlook. Most importantly, the tendency of other characters in Poirot novels and stories to underestimate Poirot precisely because of his foreignness and comedic attributes acts as a salutary warning to Christie's readers not to make the same mistake. Part of the reason Christie is able to pull off this balancing act, apart from her own skills as a writer, of course, is that by the time she began publishing in the 1920s, the figure of the detective was familiar to readers of mystery and suspense fiction. Christie could both assume the reader's knowledge of this type and assume that the reader would recognize and appreciate her efforts to innovate this figure. In other words, the high degree of self-consciousness that Christie brought to all aspects of her work was especially successful in both reformulating while simultaneously remaining true to certain core elements of the detective figure. We can see this combination of tradition and innovation at work particularly clearly if we consider briefly Christie's other great contribution to the detective figure, Miss Jane Marple. Much of this character's tremendous popularity can be attributed to the fact that she encapsulates certain qualities traditionally associated with the detective, such as her amateur status. But because Miss Marple is such an unassuming, unthreatening character, it's easy to overlook the extent to which she is a revolutionary figure in mystery and suspense fiction. For one thing, Miss Marple radically democratizes what it means to be a detective. Unlike Dupin and Holmes, Miss Marple relies not on specialized and technical forms of knowledge, but rather on her knowledge of her community and of human nature. A key reason we respond to her so enthusiastically is that we can easily imagine employing the same skills. Though Marple is undoubtedly something of a busybody, she's an endearing figure because we can see that she genuinely has the interests of her community at heart. Despite being something of an outsider by virtue of being an elderly spinster, in every other respect, she lives at the heart of the village of St. Mary Mead, and she does everything she can to protect that community. Finally, of course, and this is a point that's so obvious that it's easily overlooked, there is the fact that Miss Marple is female, which is easily the most innovative aspect of this character. In other words, Miss Marple gives us the opportunity to consider the possibility that part of the reason we so automatically recognize and support the authority of the detective figure is because the vast majority of them are male. Although it would not be strictly accurate to call Agatha Christie a feminist, at least not in today's sense of that word, there's no doubt that Miss Marple is a radical figure within the genre of mystery and suspense fiction. She illustrates the fact that women characters can also be used to personify knowledge, authority, and justice. There can be no better example of just how much variety and complexity can be contained in the figure of the detective. In closing, I want to note a curious fact. The most popular detectives are often not as popular with their creators. Christie, for example, stopped writing Poirot mysteries for a number of years because she found the character so irritating, and Doyle famously tried to kill off Holmes in The Final Problem, only to be forced to bring him back by popular demand, including, it was rumoured, the demand of Queen Victoria herself. After that, he made his peace with this character. Although authors of mystery and suspense fiction may sometimes become frustrated with what they perceive as the limits of the detective figure, it's obvious that the detective continues to exert enormous influence and remains hugely popular among readers of the genre. Why is this? There are innumerable answers to this question, of course, but for our purposes, the one I would isolate goes back to the murders in the Rue Morgue, when Poe describes the characteristic activity of the analyst as a type of ratiocination that disentangles. In the 21st century, when contemporary life appears to be more complex and tangled than ever before, is it any wonder that we still need and respond to characters who tell us that things still make sense, that order can be restored, that rationality and certainty can still triumph over the irrational and the uncertain? With this in mind, it's clear that the detective will remain indispensable for the foreseeable future.